April 18th, 1942. The USS Hornet, call sign Shangri-La, pitches violently in the cold grey waters of the North Pacific, roughly 650 miles east of Tokyo. The deck is slick with spray, and 16 twin-engine bombers North American B-25 Mitchells are lashed down in rows so tight their wingtips nearly kiss. These aircraft were never designed to launch from a carrier. Their wingspan is too wide, their weight too heavy, their takeoff run too long. Every pilot on board knows the math doesn't work. The runway beneath their wheels is 467 feet of floating steel, and they need at least 800 feet to get airborne with a full combat load. And yet, here they are, 80 volunteers about to attempt something that defies both logic and physics, led by a man whose very name will become synonymous with audacious, improbable courage. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error couldn't be thinner. 4 months earlier, the Japanese Empire delivered a devastating blow to the United States at Pearl Harbor. A strike so complete, so humiliating, that it shattered the illusion of American invulnerability in a single morning. Now, as winter gives way to spring in 1942, the Pacific belongs to Japan. Their forces have swept through Southeast Asia like a tidal wave. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all fallen. American morale is in freefall. Defeatism whispers in the halls of power. The public is terrified, angry, demanding action. President Franklin Roosevelt needs anything to prove that America can strike back, that the enemy homeland isn't untouchable, that this war isn't already lost. This is the context in which the impossible becomes necessary. This is how a middle-aged lieutenant colonel with a reputation for reckless flying and unorthodox thinking convinces the most powerful military in the world to let him try something that has never been done before and probably shouldn't be attempted now. This is the story of the Doolittle Raid mission, born of desperation, executed with extraordinary courage, and remembered as one of the most psychologically devastating strikes in military history, even though its material damage was almost negligible. It's a story about what happens when you have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. It's about 80 men who knew they probably wouldn't come back, but went anyway. And it begins not with a battle plan, but with a single, crazy idea. In the cold, anxious winter of early 1942, the United States is a nation in crisis, groping for a response to catastrophe. The attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,400 Americans and crippled the Pacific Fleet in a matter of hours. In the weeks that followed, the bad news kept coming like hammer blows. Wake Island fell after a desperate, heroic defense. Guam was overrun in a single day. In the Philippines, Douglas MacArthur's forces were being pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula, where tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops faced starvation, disease, and inevitable defeat. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, fell in February, with 80,000 British Empire troops marching into captivity. The Japanese war machine seemed unstoppable, and their carrier fleet, the same force that struck Pearl Harbor, roamed the Pacific with impunity, untouched and untouchable. But geography, as it turns out, is negotiable if you're willing to think unconventionally. In early January 1942, a Navy captain named Francis Lowe was observing landing practice at Norfolk Naval Station when he watched Army bombers making simulated takeoffs from a runway painted to resemble a carrier deck. Something clicked. What if it wasn't just practice? What if you actually launched Army bombers from a Navy carrier? The idea was absurd on its face. Army bombers were far too large and heavy for carrier operations. Carriers launched small, lightweight fighters and torpedo planes, not lumbering medium bombers with 67-foot wingspans. But Lowe took the idea to Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, who was desperate enough to consider it. King called in his air operations officer, Captain Donald Wu Duncan, who did some rough calculations and concluded that yes, theoretically, a B-25 Mitchell bomber could take off from a carrier deck if it was stripped down, loaded carefully, and flown by an exceptionally skilled pilot. Landing back on the carrier would be impossible, but taking off, maybe, just maybe. King approved the concept, but knew he needed the right man to lead it. Someone with the technical expertise, the flying skills, and the sheer audacity to pull off something this insane. There was really only one choice. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, age 45, a man whose career read like a highlight reel of aviation history. Doolittle wasn't just a pilot, he was a legend. He'd won the Schneider Trophy in 1925, setting a seaplane speed record. He'd performed the first successful instrument landing in 1929, Flying blind, using only cockpit instruments, a breakthrough that revolutionized aviation. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He'd raced planes, tested planes, broken speed records, and survived crashes that should have killed him. He was also, by all accounts, fearless to the point of recklessness. A man who seemed to have no concept of his own mortality. When Doolittle was briefed on the mission concept in late January, his response was immediate and characteristically direct. "It can be done. I'll lead it." The plan that emerged over the next several weeks was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. The USS Hornet would carry 16 B-25 bombers westward across the Pacific, escorted by a task force including the carrier Enterprise. They would sail to within 400 to 500 miles of Japan, close enough for the bombers to reach Tokyo and other targets, but far enough to minimize the risk of detection. The B-25s would launch in the late afternoon, strike at dusk, and then continue west toward China, where they would land at friendly airfields and the crews would be evacuated. There would be no going back to the carrier. The bombers couldn't land on a carrier deck even if they wanted to. This was a one-way mission in every practical sense. If anything went wrong, if they were detected early, if the weather turned bad, if they couldn't find the Chinese airfields in the dark, the crews would be on their own. 1,500 miles deep in enemy-controlled territory, with no support and no rescue. Doolittle handpicked his crews with meticulous care. He needed volunteers, but not just any volunteers. He needed men who could fly a B-25 with surgical precision, who could navigate by dead reckoning over open ocean, who could stay calm under fire, and who understood that they were almost certainly not coming home. He didn't lie to them. In briefing after briefing, he made the dangers clear. This mission was experimental, untested, and extraordinarily risky. Some of you will die. Some of you will be captured. If you want out, there's no shame in it. Not a single man backed out. 80 airmen pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, volunteered to fly into the heart of the enemy empire on a mission that existed somewhere between brilliance and madness. For 6 weeks, the crews trained in secret at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing short-field takeoffs over and over until they could get a fully loaded B-25 off the ground in under 500 feet. They stripped their aircraft of everything non-essential. The lower gun turret was removed. Armor plating was minimized. Every excess pound was jettisoned. They installed extra fuel tanks in the bomb bay and the crawl space behind the cockpit, turning each plane into a flying gas can. They practiced low-level navigation, bombing runs, and emergency procedures. They studied maps of Japan until they could draw Tokyo's streets from memory. And all the while, they asked themselves the same question. Would it actually work? Or were they training for an elaborate state-sponsored suicide mission? On April 1st, 1942, 16 B-25s were loaded onto the USS Hornet at Alameda Naval Air Station in California. The carrier's deck was so crowded that sailors had to park their vehicles in the hangar bay. Doolittle's bombers sat wingtip to wingtip, lashed down against the Pacific winds. The next day, the Hornet set sail, destination unknown to everyone except the senior officers. The men on board watched the California coastline disappear behind them and wondered if they'd ever see home again. The Pacific in April is not a forgiving place. As Task Force 16, composed of the Hornet, the Enterprise, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 oilers steamed westward toward Japan, the weather deteriorated into a cold, grey hell of churning seas and howling winds. Waves crashed over the Hornet's bow with enough force to rattle the B-25s in their moorings. Sailors moved across the deck in teams, constantly checking the tie-downs, tightening chains, making sure the bombers didn't shift or break loose. The aircraft themselves looked absurdly out of place on a carrier deck. These were land-based bombers, heavy and angular, designed to operate from concrete runways in the American heartland, not from a pitching, rolling platform in the middle of a hostile ocean. The incongruity was lost on no one. Some of the Navy personnel joked darkly that they were ferrying the Army's bombers to their graves. The Army pilots, for their part, tried not to think about the fact that the steel deck beneath their feet was all that stood between them and thousands of feet of black water. Life aboard the Hornet during those 2 weeks was a strange blend of monotony and mounting tension. The crews couldn't practice. There was nowhere to fly. So they waited. They played cards, wrote letters they couldn't send, and obsessively checked their equipment. Doolittle moved among them constantly, a reassuring, energetic presence, asking questions, offering advice, making small adjustments to the plan. He had a gift for projecting confidence, but privately, he was acutely aware of how many things could go wrong. The weather could turn even worse, making takeoff impossible. Japanese patrols could detect the task force early, forcing them to abort or face a naval battle that would cost American lives and ships. The Chinese airfields might not receive the coded message about their arrival, leaving the crews with nowhere to land. Worst of all, even if everything went according to plan, there was no guarantee that 16 unescorted bombers could penetrate Japanese air defenses, hit their targets, and escape. This was a calculated risk, but the calculation had so many variables that the outcome was anyone's guess. On April 13th, the Hornet rendezvoused with Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 17, centered around the carrier Enterprise. Halsey was a bulldog of a commander, aggressive and profane, exactly the kind of leader you wanted for a mission like this. He signaled the Hornet with characteristic bluntness. "This force is bound for Tokyo." A cheer went up from the sailors who'd been guessing at their destination for nearly 2 weeks. Now they knew they were taking the fight to the enemy homeland, something no American force had done since the war began. The knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every man aboard understood that they were deep in enemy waters now, beyond the reach of friendly support, operating on the razor's edge between boldness and disaster. The final briefing took place on April 17th. Doolittle gathered his 80 airmen in the Hornet's ready room and went over the plan one last time. They would launch at dawn on April 19th, hit their targets during daylight, and fly to China in the late afternoon, landing after dark at airfields that would be marked with signal fires. The targets were carefully selected: industrial facilities, oil refineries, military installations in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. This wasn't a terror bombing campaign aimed at civilians, despite what Japanese propaganda would later claim, but a precision strike against strategic assets. The rules of engagement were explicit: avoid non-military targets, avoid the Imperial Palace, focus on war-supporting industry. Doolittle emphasized the psychological objective as much as the physical one. "We're not going to do much material damage," he admitted, "but we're going to scare the hell out of them. We're going to show them that their homeland isn't safe, that their defenses aren't perfect, and that America can reach out and touch them anytime we want." The men listened in tense silence, absorbing the weight of what they were about to attempt. That night, sleep was impossible for most of the crew. Some wrote final letters to wives, girlfriends, parents, letters they entrusted to shipmates with instructions to mail them if they didn't return. Some prayed. Some sat in silence, staring at the bulkheads, lost in thought. The ship's chaplain moved quietly through the compartments, offering what comfort he could, though he knew that faith was cold comfort to men who were about to fly into a buzzsaw. Outside, the Pacific churned and heaved under a low, oppressive sky. The temperature hovered around +8 degrees Celsius, cold enough that the spray froze on the deck rails. Somewhere out there in the darkness, 650 miles to the west, Japan slept, unaware, unprepared, about to receive a wake-up call that would change the trajectory of the war. But fate, as always, had other plans. At 3 a.m. on April 18th, the radar operators on the Enterprise picked up a surface contact. A Japanese picket boat, one of dozens that patrolled the approaches to the Japanese home islands. The task force immediately altered course, but it was too late. At 7:30 a.m., with dawn breaking cold and grey over the Pacific, the USS Nashville spotted another picket boat, the Nitomaru, a small fishing vessel converted for patrol duty. The Nashville opened fire with its deck guns, and the little boat exploded in a shower of splinters and flame. But before it sank, the Nitomaru got off a radio message. 3 enemy aircraft carriers sighted. The message was garbled, inaccurate. There were only 2 carriers, and the contact position was off by miles, but it was enough. Japanese naval headquarters received the warning. Air defense units across the Kanto Plain went on alert. The element of surprise, so carefully cultivated over 2 weeks of silent running, was gone. On the bridge of the Hornet, Admiral Mark Mitcher faced an impossible decision. They were still 650 miles from Tokyo, over 200 miles farther out than planned. If they launched now, the bombers would barely have enough fuel to reach the Chinese coast, let alone the designated airfields. If they aborted and turned back, the mission was over, the months of training wasted, the opportunity lost. There was no good choice, only degrees of bad. Mitcher looked at Doolittle, who had come to the bridge the moment the alarm sounded. "Can you make it?" Mitcher asked. Doolittle did the math in his head: fuel consumption, distance, wind speed, margin of error. The numbers were brutal but not quite impossible. He nodded slowly. "We'll make it." It wasn't a promise. It was a declaration of intent. Mitscher gave the order. "Army pilots, man your planes." At 8:20 a.m. on April 18, 1942, the deck of the USS Hornet became the stage for one of the most extraordinary sequences in military aviation history. The ship swung into the wind, pitching and rolling in heavy seas that sent salt spray cascading across the flight deck. The wind was gusting at 30 knots, useful for generating lift, but dangerously unpredictable. The waves were running at 10 to 12 feet, causing the carrier's bow to rise and fall through a vertical range of nearly 60 feet. Every time the ship crested a wave, the forward edge of the deck pointed skyward at a dizzying angle. Every time it plunged into a trough, the deck tilted down toward the churning water below. This was the runway from which 16 heavily loaded bombers, each weighing over 31,000 pounds fully fueled, would attempt to launch. There were no catapults, no arresting gear, no safety nets. Just 467 feet of deck, a lot of hope, and the skill of pilots who had trained their entire adult lives for exactly this kind of impossible task. Doolittle's plane was first in line, positioned so close to the bow that his nose wheel hung over the edge. This wasn't bravado, it was leadership. If this worked, he wanted to show his men it could be done. If it didn't work, if he rolled off the deck and plunged into the ocean, then at least he'd fail first and spare them the same fate. He sat in the cockpit running through his checklist with mechanical precision, trying to ignore the way the horizon pitched and yawed through his windscreen. Beside him, his co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole watched the deck crew for the signal. Behind them, Bombardier Fred Bramer and Navigator Henry Potter braced themselves in the nose compartment, feeling every lurch and shudder of the ship through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. In the rear, Gunner Paul Leonard crouched behind his weapon, wondering if he'd ever get the chance to use it. The deck officer raised his flag, then swung it in a circle, signaling Doolittle to rev his engines to full power. The B-25's twin Wright Cyclone engines screamed, the propellers blurring into silver discs. The noise was overwhelming, a visceral, chest-rattling roar that drowned out thought. Doolittle held the brakes, feeling the plane strain against them like a leashed animal. He kept his eyes locked on the deck officer, who was timing the carrier's pitch, waiting for the precise moment when the bow reached the bottom of a trough and began to rise. That moment, that single instant when the deck was angled upward and the relative wind was strongest, was the only window for a successful launch. Miss it, and the bomber would either stall in the climb or simply roll off the end of the deck and crash into the Pacific. The flag came down. Doolittle released the brakes and shoved the throttles to the firewall. The B-25 lunged forward, accelerating hard, its wheels hammering against the wooden deck planks. Sailors dove flat as the bomber roared past, its prop wash tearing at their uniforms. The deck rushed by in a blur, 300 feet, 400 feet, 450 feet. Doolittle pulled back gently on the yoke, not too much, not too soon, feeling for the moment when the wings would generate enough lift to overcome gravity. The bow edge hurtled toward him. He had maybe 2 seconds to get airborne or die. At 467 feet, with perhaps 10 feet of deck remaining, the B-25's wheels left the carrier. For a sickening instant, the bomber hung in the air, not quite flying, not quite falling, balanced on the knife edge between aerodynamics and disaster. Then the carrier's bow rose on a wave, giving the plane an extra nudge of upward momentum, and suddenly the B-25 was climbing, clawing for altitude, the ocean falling away beneath it. Doolittle leveled off at 50 feet, just above the wavetops, and set course for Tokyo. His hands were steady on the controls, but his heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers followed. Lieutenant Travis Hoover in plane number 2, Lieutenant Bob Gray in number 3. Each launch was a fresh miracle, a fresh gamble against physics and fate. Some pilots got airborne with deck to spare. Others cleared the bow by margins so slim that sailors watching from the island's superstructure held their breath until the wheels lifted. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy, piloting plane number 15, had one of the shortest takeoff rolls. His bomber leapt into the air with nearly 40 feet of deck remaining, prompting cheers from the deck crew. The last plane, piloted by Lieutenant Bill Farrow, launched at 9:20 a.m., exactly 1 hour after Doolittle's departure. 71 minutes, 16 launches, 16 successful takeoffs. Not a single aircraft was lost. The impossible had become merely improbable. The pilots formed up loosely, staying low to avoid radar detection, and turned west toward Japan. Behind them, the Hornet and its escorts swung around and fled east at maximum speed, racing to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the inevitable Japanese response. The flight to Tokyo took 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours of monotonous tension punctuated by moments of stark terror. The bombers flew in loose pairs and singles, maintaining radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning and celestial fixes when the sun broke through the clouds. They skimmed the wave tops at 50 to 200 feet, low enough to stay under radar but high enough to avoid the spray. The cockpits were freezing at those altitudes, the heating systems barely functioned, and the cold Pacific air leaked through every seam and rivet. The crews huddled in their flight suits and leather jackets, sipping coffee from thermoses, watching the grey ocean scroll endlessly beneath them. Some saw Japanese fishing boats and patrol craft and veered around them. Others spotted land, the craggy, forested coast of Honshu Island, and felt their pulses quicken. It was real now. They were over enemy territory. There was no turning back. Doolittle's plane crossed the Japanese coastline at 12:15 p.m. local time, somewhere north of Tokyo. The weather had cleared slightly, revealing a patchwork landscape of rice paddies, forests, and small villages connected by narrow roads. It looked peaceful, almost pastoral, not like the heartland of an empire at war. Doolittle climbed to 1,500 feet for the bomb run, high enough to avoid most small arms fire, but low enough to ensure accuracy. Tokyo sprawled ahead, a vast urban expanse along the shores of Tokyo Bay. He could see the harbour, the factories, the rail yards, all the targets he'd studied on maps for weeks. And then he saw something else. People. Civilians on the streets, going about their daily routines, completely unaware that American bombers were overhead. Some looked up and waved, mistaking the B-25s for Japanese aircraft returning from training exercises. The surrealism of the moment was almost overwhelming. Here was the enemy homeland, and it was so normal. No air raid sirens, no anti-aircraft fire, no fighters scrambling to intercept. Just a city caught completely off guard. At 12:30 p.m., Doolittle's bombardier toggled the release, and 4 500-pound incendiary clusters tumbled from the bomb bay. The plane lurched upwards, suddenly lighter. Doolittle banked hard and dove for the deck, heading west at full throttle. Behind him, Tokyo erupted. The bombs hit a factory complex, igniting fires that sent columns of black smoke boiling into the sky. Air raid sirens finally began to wail, a thin, belated scream across the city. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up, firing blindly at an enemy they couldn't see clearly. Japanese fighters Zeros and Oscars scrambled from airfields around Tokyo, but by the time they reached altitude, the B-25s were gone, racing westward at treetop level, too low and too fast to intercept effectively. Over the next hour, the remaining 15 bombers struck targets across Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Some crews faced intense anti-aircraft fire. Others encountered almost no resistance. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, flying plane number 7, bombed an oil refinery in Yokohama, and then had to ditch in the ocean off the Chinese coast when his fuel ran out, losing part of his leg in the crash. Lieutenant Bill Farrow's plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Tokyo, but managed to limp westward before running out of fuel over Japanese-occupied China, where he and his crew were captured. Lieutenant Bob Gray's crew bombed a factory in Tokyo, then flew through a barrage of flak so intense they could hear shrapnel pinging off the fuselage. Every crew had a different experience, but all of them shared the same surreal exhilaration of striking the enemy homeland and somehow, against all odds, getting away with it. By 2:00 p.m., all 16 bombers had dropped their ordnance and turned toward China. Now came the hardest part, surviving the flight to freedom. They had roughly 200 miles to cover, most of it over Japanese-held territory, and their fuel gauges were dropping into the red. The early launch meant they were burning fuel faster than planned, fighting headwinds that hadn't been forecast. One by one, the engines began to sputter and choke. Doolittle's crew crossed the Chinese coast just after dark and immediately faced a new problem. The signal fires that were supposed to mark the friendly airfields were nowhere to be seen. The message about their arrival had either not been received or not understood. The airfields were dark. The countryside was dark. They were flying blind over hostile terrain with empty tanks. At 9:30 p.m., Doolittle gave the order to bail out. His crew tumbled into the night sky over the mountains of Zhejiang province, parachuting into darkness, hoping they'd land in friendly territory. They did, barely. Chinese villagers found them the next morning, bruised and exhausted but alive. Of the 80 men who launched from the Hornet that morning, 69 survived the immediate aftermath of the raid. 3 were killed in crashes or drownings. 8 were captured by Japanese forces in China and subjected to interrogations and torture that violated every standard of international law. Of those 8, 3 were executed by firing squad in a kangaroo court proceeding that had the veneer of legality but was really just murder dressed up in judicial language. 1 more died of malnutrition and disease in captivity. The remaining 4 endured years of brutal imprisonment before being liberated in 1945, their bodies wrecked, their spirits barely intact. These men: Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, Harold Spatz, Robert Meader, Chase Nielsen, Robert Haight, Jacob DeShazer, and George Barr paid the highest price for their courage. Their names deserve to be remembered alongside the mission they flew. The other survivors, including Doolittle, were sheltered by Chinese civilians and resistance fighters who risked their own lives to protect the American airmen. These acts of courage and compassion came at a horrific cost. The Japanese military, enraged by the raid and humiliated by their failure to prevent it, launched a campaign of retaliation against the Chinese population that can only be described as genocidal. In the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, where many of the American crews came down, Japanese forces systematically destroyed over 200 villages, burning homes, slaughtering livestock, and executing an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians. The Doolittle Raid, which was intended to strike a blow against Japanese militarism, inadvertently triggered one of the worst atrocities of the war, a fact that haunted Doolittle for the rest of his life. He once said, "I thought it would be the end of my career, and the deaths of those innocent people made me sick." But the mission accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish, and the price was paid by people who had no say in the matter. It was a brutal calculus, the kind that makes comfortable moral judgments impossible. Back in the United States, news of the raid electrified the nation. On April 21st, 3 days after the raid, President Roosevelt held a press conference and coyly told reporters that the bombers had launched from Shangri-La, a reference to the fictional Himalayan paradise in the novel Lost Horizon. The public didn't care about the details, they cared about the result. America had struck back. The enemy homeland had been hit. The war wasn't hopeless. Morale, which had been in freefall since Pearl Harbor, surged. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines. Radio broadcasts celebrated the daring raid. The name Doolittle became synonymous with American resolve and ingenuity. When Doolittle returned to the United States in May, he was promoted to Brigadier General and awarded the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony. He had expected to be court-martialed for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, he was treated as a national hero. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I felt I had failed," he later wrote. "I lost every airplane. I thought they'd send me home in disgrace. Instead, they gave me a medal." But the real impact of the Doolittle Raid wasn't measured in destroyed factories or bombed refineries. The material damage was negligible. Some fires, some broken glass, some interrupted production schedules. The psychological damage, however, was profound and far-reaching. In Japan, the raid shattered the carefully maintained narrative of invulnerability. For months, the Japanese public had been told that the home islands were safe, that the enemy couldn't reach them, that the war was being won on distant fronts. Now, American bombers had flown over Tokyo in broad daylight, dropped bombs, and escaped. The implications were terrifying. If the Americans could do it once, they could do it again. And next time, the attack might be bigger, more destructive. The Japanese military leadership, already paranoid about the possibility of further raids, made a series of strategic decisions that would ultimately prove disastrous. The most significant consequence was the decision to expand the defensive perimeter in the Pacific to prevent future carrier-based raids. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, became convinced that Japan needed to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them once and for all. This obsession with eliminating the carrier threat led directly to the Battle of Midway, fought 6 weeks after the Doolittle Raid. At Midway, the Japanese Navy suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots, a blow from which it never recovered. Historians still debate the causal chain, but the consensus is clear. The Doolittle Raid forced Japan to overextend, to take risks it didn't need to take, and to fight a battle it wasn't prepared to win. In that sense, Doolittle's failed mission the one that lost all 16 aircraft and inflicted minimal physical damage, may have been one of the most strategically consequential operations of the entire Pacific War. For the men who flew the raid, life moved on, though it was never quite the same. Some returned to combat duty and fought through the rest of the war. Others were grounded due to injuries or age. A few struggled with what today we'd recognize as post-traumatic stress, haunted by memories of the raid and the knowledge of what their mission had cost the Chinese people. They formed a close-knit fraternity, the Doolittle Raiders, and began meeting annually for reunions gatherings marked by laughter, remembrance, and an unspoken awareness that their ranks thinned with each passing year. They kept a private ritual, a collection of silver goblets, one engraved with each man's name, stored in a special case. At each reunion, they would perform a roll call, turning upside down the goblets of those who had died since the last gathering. It was a solemn acknowledgement of mortality and brotherhood, a way of honoring the bond forged in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Doolittle himself went on to have a distinguished career, commanding the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in Italy, and finally the 8th Air Force in England, where he oversaw the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. He survived the war, retired as a lieutenant general, and lived to the age of 96, dying in 1993. But he never stopped thinking about that April morning in 1942, about the mission that made his name famous and the costs that came with it. In interviews later in life, he was characteristically modest, deflecting praise, and insisting that the real heroes were the men who flew with him and the Chinese civilians who paid such a terrible price for helping them. "I just did what I was trained to do," he'd say. The mission was successful because of 80 brave men, not one. It was the kind of leadership philosophy that had made men willing to follow him into the impossible in the first place. The last surviving members of the raid, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, and Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, lived well into the 21st century, carrying the memory of that day for over 7 decades. Cole, who died in 2019 at age 103, spent his final years giving talks at schools and military bases, determined to keep the story alive for new generations. Thatcher, a flight engineer and gunner who helped save the crew of the plane that crashed off the Chinese coast, passed away in 2016. Their deaths marked the end of a living connection to one of World War II's most audacious operations, leaving behind only artifacts, photographs, and the stories they told to anyone willing to listen. The silver goblets, now all turned upside down, reside at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio, a permanent memorial to 80 men who dared the impossible. So what does the Doolittle Raid mean, 8 decades removed from that cold April morning? What lessons does it offer, if any, to a world that has moved so far beyond propeller-driven bombers and aircraft carriers made of riveted steel? The temptation is to view it purely through the lens of military strategy, a clever tactical gambit that exploited enemy vulnerabilities and provided a psychological boost when one was desperately needed. And certainly that's part of the story. But the deeper meaning of the raid lies not in its strategic consequences, but in what it reveals about human nature under extreme pressure, about leadership in the face of impossible odds, and about the terrible moral complexities that attend acts of war. The Doolittle Raid was born of desperation, and desperation has a way of stripping away the comfortable illusions we maintain in peacetime. It forces clarity. In the winter of 1942, the United States faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable, a public on the edge of panic, and a strategic situation that offered no good options, only degrees of bad. In that context, a crazy idea launching land-based bombers from a carrier deck became not just viable, but necessary. It required a willingness to think unconventionally, to challenge assumptions about what was possible, and to accept risks that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Doolittle understood this. When he stood before his superiors and said, "It can be done," he wasn't offering a guarantee. He was offering a gamble, backed by skill, courage, and an unshakable belief that the attempt itself was worth making, regardless of the outcome. There's something profoundly instructive in that willingness to attempt the improbable. Modern military doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force, technological superiority, precision strikes, and minimized risk to personnel. These are good things, morally and practically, but they can also breed a certain risk aversion, a reluctance to try anything that doesn't have a high probability of success. The Doolittle Raid reminds us that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the attempt matters more than the certainty of outcome. 80 men climbed into those bombers knowing full well they probably wouldn't come back. They weren't naive. They weren't ignorant of the odds. They simply decided that some missions are worth flying even when the math doesn't add up. Because the alternative, doing nothing, accepting defeat, surrendering the initiative, is worse than the risk of failure. That's not recklessness. That's a very specific kind of courage. The kind that accepts personal cost in service of a larger purpose. But the raid also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of war and the unintended consequences of even well-intentioned actions. The Chinese civilians who died in the Japanese retaliation didn't volunteer for anything. They didn't choose to be part of this story. They were simply in the wrong place when history decided to be cruel. Doolittle carried that weight for the rest of his life, and rightly so. There's no clean moral calculus here, no way to balance the strategic value of the raid against the horror of what followed. Both things are true simultaneously. The raid was necessary and justified given the circumstances, and it triggered a cascade of suffering that haunts the memory of the event. This is the nature of war. It creates impossible moral dilemmas where every choice carries a terrible cost, and the burden falls on leaders to make those choices and then live with the consequences. Easy judgments from comfortable distance are not only unhelpful, they're obscene. The only appropriate response is to remember to honor both the courage of the men who flew and the innocence of those who suffered. What the Doolittle Raid teaches us about leadership is equally complex and valuable. Doolittle didn't lead from behind. He didn't ask his men to do anything he wasn't willing to do first. When the time came to launch, his plane went first, off a pitching deck with no guarantee of success, because he understood that leadership in moments of extreme risk requires visible, personal commitment. His men followed him not because they were ordered to, but because they trusted him. Trusted his judgment, his skill, and his willingness to share their fate. That kind of leadership can't be faked or manufactured. It has to be earned through competence, honesty about risks, and a demonstrated willingness to bear the same burdens you ask others to carry. In an age where leadership is often discussed in terms of management techniques and organizational charts, the Doolittle Raid offers a reminder that in the most critical moments, people follow individuals, not positions or ranks. They follow someone who looks them in the eye, tells them the truth, and then turns toward the danger first. The technological dimension of the story is worth noting as well, though it's often overshadowed by the human drama. The raid required solving a series of engineering and logistical problems that had never been tackled before. How do you get a medium bomber off a carrier deck? How do you modify it to carry extra fuel without compromising its ability to fly? How do you navigate 1,500 miles over open ocean with minimal instruments and no radio contact? These weren't abstract theoretical questions. They were practical challenges that required creative solutions under time pressure with lives at stake. The success of the mission depended as much on the mechanics who modified the planes, the engineers who calculated fuel consumption, and the navigators who plotted courses as it did on the pilots who flew them. It was a collective effort, a reminder that even the most celebrated individual achievements rest on a foundation of teamwork, expertise, and attention to unglamorous details. The glory goes to the pilots. But the mission succeeds because everyone from the admiral who approves the plan to the sailor who tightens the last bolt does their job with precision and care. Perhaps most importantly, the Doolittle Raid illustrates the limits and possibilities of strategic bombing, a debate that would dominate military thinking for the rest of the war and beyond. The raid itself did almost no material damage, a few factories damaged, a few fires started, nothing that significantly impacted Japan's war-making capacity. And yet, its strategic impact was enormous. It forced Japan to divert resources to homeland defense, altered their naval strategy in ways that led to disaster at Midway, and demonstrated to both allies and enemies that American resolve was intact. This disconnect between physical destruction and strategic effect is instructive. War isn't just about destroying things. It's about affecting the enemy's will, their decision-making, their sense of security. A single bomb that lands in Tokyo and forces a fundamental reassessment of strategic priorities is worth more than 1,000 bombs that obliterate empty terrain. The Doolittle Raid achieved its objectives not through brute force, but through psychological leverage, by striking at the enemy's sense of invulnerability and forcing them to react in ways that ultimately worked against their own interests. Yet we must also acknowledge that this same logic, the idea that psychological impact matters more than physical destruction, can be twisted to justify terrible things. The firebombing campaigns that would later consume Japanese cities, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the strategic bombing of Germany, all were justified in part by arguments about morale, will, and psychological effect. There's a slippery slope here, one that Doolittle himself grappled with as the war progressed, and the bombing campaigns grew increasingly indiscriminate. Where is the line between a legitimate strategic strike and terror bombing? How do you maintain moral clarity when the enemy has shown no mercy and your own people demand vengeance? These are not questions with easy answers, but they're questions the Doolittle Raid forces us to ask, precisely because the raid itself stayed on the right side of that line. It targeted military and industrial assets, avoided civilian areas, and achieved its objectives without descending into wanton destruction. It stands as an example of what's possible when moral constraints are maintained even under extreme pressure. The raid also speaks to something deeper about the American character, or at least the idealized version of it. There's a strand in American culture that celebrates the underdog, the impossible longshot, the audacious gamble that pays off against all odds. The Doolittle Raid embodies that narrative perfectly, a small force, outmatched and outgunned, striking at the heart of a powerful enemy and getting away with it. It's the kind of story that resonates because it affirms a belief that courage and ingenuity can overcome raw power, that David can beat Goliath if he's clever enough and brave enough. But we should be careful not to romanticize this too much. The raid worked partly because of skill and courage, yes, but also because of luck, because the Japanese were caught off guard, because the weather cooperated just enough, because 1,000 things that could have gone wrong didn't. War is not a morality play where virtue is always rewarded. Sometimes courage fails. Sometimes audacity leads to disaster. The Doolittle Raid succeeded, but it easily could have been a catastrophic failure, and the same qualities we now celebrate would have been condemned as recklessness. Success has a way of retroactively justifying risk, but the risk was real, and the men who took it knew they were gambling with their lives. On a spring afternoon in April, if you stand on the deck of a modern aircraft carrier, one of the floating cities that dominate today's naval warfare, and look down at the flat expanse of the flight deck, it's almost impossible to imagine what Doolittle's crews faced. Today's carriers launch aircraft with steam catapults or electromagnetic systems that can fling a 30-ton fighter jet from 0 to 170 miles per hour in under 2 seconds. The deck is over 1,000 feet long. The technology is so advanced, so reliable, that carrier launches have become routine dangerous. Yes, but routine. But in 1942, there were no catapults rated for heavy bombers, no computers calculating thrust-to-weight ratios, no margin for error. There was just a slick deck, a howling wind, and a pilot's skill. The distance between that world and ours is measured not just in decades, but in the accumulated lessons of every mission flown, every risk taken, every failure analyzed, and every success built upon. The Doolittle Raiders are gone now, all of them. The last goblet was turned upside down in 2019 when Dick Cole passed away at 103. But the story persists, passed down through books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and the oral tradition of military culture. It persists because it's a good story, yes, dramatic, surprising, emotionally satisfying, but it persists also because it contains truths that don't age. It reminds us that impossible is often just a failure of imagination. That leadership means going first. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That moral choices in war are never clean, and the burden of those choices doesn't disappear when the shooting stops. That sometimes, when everything seems lost, a single audacious act can change the course of history, not because it destroys the enemy, but because it changes what people believe is possible. If there's a final lesson from that April morning in 1942, it might be this. History is made by people who refuse to accept that the situation is hopeless, who look at impossible odds and say, maybe we can find a way, who are willing to risk everything for a chance, just a chance to change the outcome. Doolittle and his men didn't know if they'd succeed. They didn't know if they'd survive. But they knew that the attempt mattered, that doing something, even something audacious and risky, was better than doing nothing. They climbed into those bombers with their eyes open, fully aware of what they were risking, and they flew into history. The silver goblets sit in their case now, silent witnesses to courage and sacrifice, to friendship and loss, to a moment when 80 ordinary men did something extraordinary. And every year, on April 18th, somewhere in America, someone raises a glass to their memory, to the men who proved that carriers could launch bombers, that Tokyo could be reached, that courage could be measured not in miles or bombs dropped, but in the willingness to try when everyone else said it couldn't be done. That's the Doolittle Raid. Not just a military operation, but a testament to human audacity in the face of impossible odds. Not just a historical footnote, but a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is attempt the impossible and see what happens.